welcome to this series of lectures on modern European history. We have so far spoken about the modern European history ever since 1789, the beginning of the French Revolution, the Enlightenment ideas, to the extent these ideas were responsible for the rise of or for the onset of the revolution. We have also alluded to the impact generated by the ongoing consequences of the Industrial Revolution, which had begun from Britain but was slowly bringing entire Europe, at least major Western European powers, under its impact. We have spoken about the course and consequences of different phases of the French Revolution. And through Napoleon and Napoleonic Empire, we have also tried to see earlier what was the impact of all these on other areas of Europe, because incidentally they were part of the Napoleonic Empire, in which several progressive reforms by Napoleon were also introduced. So, after the defeat of Napoleon, the Congress of Vienna in 1814 worked out the future of European politics in terms of the conservative assertion. Monarchy was back in reckoning. It was a low phase for progressive changes, republican ideas, etc., that had been spoken so many times during the revolution, with positive connotation, but there is some sense of disillusionment about the viability, about the possibility of these changes proving to be durable, and therefore Europe undergoes this this brief experimentation with the old way of ruling, and that is monarchy, right. So, in essence, this was what the Congress of Vienna had worked out for Europe. As I have said in my earlier interactions with you, that even this experiment did not prove to be very durable, because the forces of historical change were still unfolding. It was not only the power of these big Enlightenment ideas of liberty, republicanism, individuality, voting, democracy, and so forth, but the ground from within was also getting transformed on account of the consequences flowing from industrialization, increased industrialization of Europe. So, under the twin impact of liberal assertion, bourgeoisie coming into being, very subsequently even the working class, and several other ideas of, say, nationalism, socialism, they had all been impacting the people of Europe in different ways, and this arrangement where the political map of Europe was reset to pre-1789 position, with territories being given back to the ruling houses, to the monarchies who were ruling those areas before 1789 largely. This was not followed in toto, because in my earlier discussion I have already told you that the German Confederacy was created by collapsing around 300 principalities into mere 39. And the Austrian territorial interest was very much visible over here. So, it wasn't as if all the territories were given back to the ruling lineages that had been there in pre-1789 position, but largely that was what was done at the Congress of Vienna. And you can see this map. This is the arrangement that was carried out in 1815 at the Congress of Vienna. This is how different territories were handed over to different ruling lineages. However, as I said, that the political and social landscape of Europe had already been transformed. It's one thing to to impose a particular political arrangement over these areas, but social constituencies that are so critical to the survival of these political arrangements had already been transformed, and new social constituencies had been created during the Napoleonic period, which were very receptive to the ideas of liberty, republicanism, democracy, and also nationhood. Please remember, it is nationalism, it is socialism, it is liberalism that constitute three most formidable base of Europe or European history in 19th century. So, as you can see on your slide, 19th century European history can even be understood with reference to the interplay of these three concepts, these three historical tangents or coordinates. Now, please understand this. Liberalism, when we say liberalism, because this particular lecture is about the journey of liberalism in Europe, and we are only talking about the initial phase of it. Obviously, this is a big topic. It will require several other interactions with you in different timelines. We are only presently concerned with, say, 1815 to 1830 period, right? And here, what was conveyed by this word liberalism to 19th century British and French middle class meant not what we mean by this term today. There are several things that happen during the course of history. For example, the Romantic movement. Now, what we understand by liberalism today, we also owe to different agencies. Say, Romanticism added quite a few attributes of liberalism to the present understanding of liberalism. But to the 19th century British and French middle classes, it meant very limited thing, right? The way it actually unfolded in history, right? And not what went on to accumulate as the connotative capacity of a term, right? So, in the first quarter of European history, liberalism to the French and British middle class meant, number one, an efficient government that is prepared to acknowledge the value of unrestrained commercial and industrial development. What does it mean? This is about profit making. This is about moving away from, say, mercantilism. This is about doing away with the state control. This is about the freedom to, or liberty to earn profits or even losses in an unrestrained way, in an where the state does not come to interfere, right? So, obviously, as you would see that liberalism is an ideology. Historically, it worked as an ideology for the emergence of the middle class, because it provided them the opportunity to earn profits unhindered by state interference or by any other customary practices, right? Second, it also meant a government in which their interests, and there here means middle class interests, would be protected by direct representation in the legislature. So, parliamentary form of government through votings and preferably qualified right to vote. Not every and anyone would be given the right to vote. So, there could be some property qualification which ensures that the middle class gets its access to the levers of power. So, liberalism in the first quarter for the British and French middle class also meant a government in which their interests would be protected by direct representation in the legislature, in all probability a constitutional monarchy. At this point of time, they are not pitching for a republic, right, and most certainly not a democracy. They do not want that any and every citizen should have the right to vote and it should be a mere function of number, right, because they knew that if it was if it were about numbers, they would not remain in the levers of power. So, they wanted this to be very restricted as well, and to that extent, republicanism was, or creating a republic, at least in the first quarter of the 19th century Europe, was not a middle class vision, right. They wanted a state, they wanted a government where their class interest is reasonably protected, and that perhaps worked out best under constitutional monarchy. Third, obviously they wanted a foreign policy of peace and trade. Obviously this has to do with increased prospects and possibilities of commercial profit, particularly through trade. Subsequently, as industrialization deepened, even capitalism undergoes this phase change from trade capitalism or commercial capitalism to industrial capitalism. Subsequently, it even goes on to acquire the phase of financial capitalism. But at this point of time, since we are talking of the first quarter, largely the first quarter of the 19th century Europe, they wanted, the middle class of France and England wanted a foreign policy which fosters peace and trade. Fourth, obviously they also believed in individualism and the doctrines of the classical economists, that is like laissez-faire, where the state does not interfere, and it is individualism, and individual, as per Adam Smith, is man is born a savage, calculating self, and the best economic or financial architecture or market architecture that can be given to him, humans, is a free market where the innate nature of mankind can be satiated. So that's the way Adam Smith justifies the market system, the free market system, and he thinks that this is how man will be most happy. If you compare that to what Karl Marx had to say about socialism, Karl Marx begins with this presumption about man as being born social entity. So man is born a social entity, and therefore to think of an individualized, extremely individualized way for happiness is antithetical to the innate nature of mankind. So as per Marx, it is socialism that works out well, or that works out best to satisfy the innate nature of mankind. So that was beside the point. For the 19th century British and French middle class, this is what liberalism meant in a very restricted sense of the term, right? Beyond Britain and France, of course, the understanding was little different, and please remember, we are doing history, and therefore I am not approaching liberalism from the textbook, political science textbook definition of liberalism, or what the philosophers had spoken about liberalism, the way they had defined it. Remember, I have already told that these terms over a period of time across history go on to add attributes to the extent that our understanding in 21st century about liberalism is quite different from the way it was understood in a particular area or by a particular set of people, say in 19th century, and that is precisely what we discussed so far, that for the British and French middle class it meant something very limited. However, outside Britain and France, and remember that we are talking of the times which is post-Napoleonic, and therefore these areas had sometime in past been part of Napoleonic Empire, so they had experienced first hand as to what it means by rule of law, by throwing careers open to talent, and so forth. So, or how the state bureaucracy works, right, in a very systematic, efficient way, and so forth. So, there is some kind of a lure for having that kind of a setup rather, or instead of the old monarchical setup where it is through lineage and state association that people are important. So, outside Britain and France, it was generally believed that chances of achieving liberal goals can be greatly enhanced if they could unify the patchwork of principalities that surrounded them into a vigorous modern nation states. Right? It's here that the point that I had made towards the beginning of this lecture, perhaps in the earlier segment of this lecture, becomes relevant, and that is that it is not only liberalism, but you also have to understand that nationalism and subsequently even socialism, those forces are at work, and these historical entities that emerged in the 19th century Europe, say the nation states, right. So, nation states emerged with the anticipation that nation states would give to its citizens, those who are under a particular nation state, a liberal regime, right. So, they are two facets, they are the two sides of the same coin. So, if you are clamoring for a liberal regime situated outside France and Britain in the first quarter of 19th century, then you are also thinking that the best way to ensure that you have a liberal regime is by creating a modern nation state. And how will you create a modern state, modern nation state? By unifying the small principalities that surround a particular community or a particular area into a viable political entity that can go as a nation state, as a viable nation state with a defined territory, with an army, with a bureaucracy, and so forth, right. So, merely very I would say small ethnic basis will not work, but you have to move out and galvanize people around you to come together and explore the possibility of their being part of one nation. So, that is how the sense of nation state also grew alongside liberalism, right, and one fed into the possibility of the other, nationalism and liberalism at this point of time, or nation state and liberalism. 1815 to 1830, the period that we are talking about, essentially can be regarded as the period of conservative reaction, where after the Congress of Vienna, it is the conservatives, it is the monarchists, it is the traditionalists, it is the reactionaries who are at work, who are at advantage. The overall mood favors them. The harbinger of rule of law, republicanism or French ideas had been defeated in the form of Napoleon, and monarchies or the traditionalists could say that I had told you that it will lead to this kind of a chaotic situation. So, it is better to have the old arrangement. So, that is the overall mood, but as time and again we have been saying that the times had changed, historical agencies had changed, historical context had changed, and even this arrangement would not last long. Nevertheless, from historical classification point of view, yes, 1815 to 1830 appears to be a period where conservatives are back, monarchies are back, traditionalism is back, but the forces and pockets of liberalism kept fighting them. Ultimately, obviously, monarchy had to go, but during this phase it appears to be reinstated and reinstated reasonably formidably to begin with, while by the time we reach 1830s and 1840s the cracks had become wide open. So, post Napoleon and post Vienna Congress, the frightened aristocratic rulers were concerned about the comeback of revolutionary upheavals, and hence after the formation of monarchies and reinstatement of different monarchies, ruling lineages in these areas, these rulers started resorting to repressive policies wherever some kind of a liberal threat or a radical challenge was posed in their areas. However, instead of killing them, instead of finishing them, it only made liberals more determined, because as I said that liberalism was fueled by several other historical factors at work. Continued industrialization, the idea of the nation state and so forth, right. So, the overall approach of the leaders at the Vienna Congress was to come together to ensure that they are not overthrown, that this monarchical arrangement is not overthrown. And as a consequence of that, you have a quadruple alliance that is forged between Britain, Austria, Prussia and Russia. Subsequently, in 1818, post the defeat of Napoleon and the Vienna Congress, France also joined this to make it quintuple alliance. Now, please understand, this is not about nations, this is about monarchy versus some other arrangement. It could be constitutional monarchy, it could be republicanism, right. It is between traditionalism or the liberals versus the monarchists, right. Obviously, the idea behind these quadruple or quintuple alliances was to cooperate whenever a situation arises in any of these territories, in any of these monarchies, which required suppression of attempts to overthrow the legitimate government or to alter international boundaries. So, wherever there was some kind of a liberal threat, wherever there was some kind of a progressive change or some disturbance or some clamor for progressive changes and so forth, they were supposed to come together to protect monarchy in a sense. Even Russia's Holy Alliance too essentially was only repressionist and not progressive. So, in 1820 we also have a Troppau conference, where Austria, Prussia and Russia met to suppress the liberal rebellions in Naples and Spain, which was spearheaded by Carbonaris. The movement had even forced these reactionary kings of Naples and Spain to take oaths to establish constitutions modeled on the liberal French constitution of 1789-91. That is why here you get an example as to how these pockets of liberalism are still surviving, and they are posing challenge to these reinstatement of monarchies in different parts of Europe. In 1822, another Congress was convened at Verona in Italy to deal with the continuing liberal threat to stability in Spain, particularly in its South American colonies and the Near East. So, France sent army to assist King Ferdinand VII of Spain in successfully ending the liberal threat. However, the same couldn't be replicated in the case of the colonies of Central and South America, who rather moved to independence and liberation. So, as I said that very soon this arrangement of reinstatement of monarchy was supposed to crack, and this obviously was because of the Monroe Doctrine in operation in South America, and also the British who were ready to recognize independence of the South American republics, since they were these republics or colonies in South America were ready to trade with Britain rather than Spain. So, Britain used navy to keep Spain from intervening in South American empire. So, what do you find here? That more than showing commitment to ensure survival of monarchy, now commercial interests of different nations are at work, and monarchy is a spent force, or this arrangement would not last long. In the Near East, again in 1821, we have Alexander Ypsilanti, a Greek soldier who attempted to form a Greek empire that was vaguely on liberal principles, vaguely built on liberal principles. Armed battles against the Turks who ruled over Greece ensured during this disturbance. Ypsilanti was defeated, all right, but the movement lived on as an independence movement, and later a joint Anglo-French-Russian naval intervention ensured that the rebels succeeded this time. So, liberal clamor is now in ascendancy, right? Therefore, what emerges is that by 1830, after say around 15 years of its existence, the arrangement worked out at the Congress of Vienna could no longer prove to be long lasting, and Metternich and other reactionaries who had built alliances on the assumption that the powers of Europe or the preservation of the status quo would be the major goal, would not prove to be long lasting, and that is what gets very visible by the time we reach 1830s, that the cracks had become wide open and visible to the people at large by around 1830 of the arrangement that was done at the Congress of Vienna. Thank you.